The first thing people noticed wasn't the little girl. It was the violin. A violin so broken it looked like it had survived a fire and a flood and still refused to give up. Its body was patched with strips of electrical tape. The strings didn't match. The bow carried only a thin fringe of hair, as if it had been chewed by time itself. And yet the child holding it clutched it with a gentleness reserved for living things. That was the moment the room changed. It was supposed to be an ordinary taping day for a popular family show, full of giggles and applause and proud parents recording their kids' big moment on their phones. But nothing about what was about to happen belonged to ordinary. When she stepped on stage, she carried not just an instrument, she carried a story no one was prepared for. Her name was Lena Khaled, just 7 years old, though her eyes looked older, as if they had watched too much of life too early. Her dark curls framed a face that held both softness and a weary kind of wisdom. She wore a second-hand white dress, ironed carefully by her mother that morning, and shoes slightly too big because they were the only ones the donation center had in her size. Backstage, the crew had been whispering about the violin before they even knew the girl's name. One producer had winced at the sight of it. Another suggested finding a replacement prop. But Lena had refused to let anyone touch it. She held the old instrument to her heart, like a heartbeat she didn't want anyone else to hear. Her mother sat in the front row, hands clenched tightly in her lap, knuckles white, shoulders shaking with the silent tremble of someone who had lived in survival mode for too long. Beside her sat a translator from a refugee agency, a patient woman who had learned to read emotions faster than words. The mother didn't speak English yet, only a few phrases, but she didn't need a language to understand that her daughter was about to step into a world very different from the one they had escaped. 3 years earlier, their world had been a small apartment in northern Syria, a humble place filled with noise and neighbors and the smell of jasmine tea. Lena's father, Sami, had been a violin maker, nothing famous, but talented enough that locals called him the man who could make wood sing. Their home had always echoed with music, unfinished melodies, practice scales, lullabies played on old strings. Then the sky began to fall. At first it was distant, then it was everywhere. Bombs turned streets into shadows, families into memories. One night, after a blast shook their building, Lena's father pushed his daughter into her mother's arms and screamed for them to run. The last thing Lena saw, as her mother dragged her into the street, was her father turning back into the smoke to rescue his instruments. He didn't come back out. In the chaos of escape, Lena's mother had grabbed one thing lying near the doorway. A violin her husband had been repairing and refused to sell, because he said one day it would be perfect. It wasn't perfect when she grabbed it. It was cracked, the tailpiece damaged, the varnish scraped, but it was the last piece of him she had touched. Through crowds, checkpoints, freezing nights, and a journey full of strangers and fear, the violin had stayed with them. Lena grew quiet in those days, the kind of quiet that is less about peace and more about loss. But she held the violin every night until sleep came. The refugee camp in Jordan was a desert of waiting, waiting for food, waiting for warmth, waiting for news, waiting for hope. Life shrank into small routines, long lines, dusty tents, whispered prayers. Children rarely laughed there. Yet every sunset, a miracle happened. A man named Dowd, once a concert violinist before the war shattered his stage, would sit outside his tent and play. His music was the only gentle thing in a place made of grief. Lena never missed a single evening. She would sit cross-legged in the dirt, unmoving, watching his hands slide across the fingerboard like they were telling stories she desperately needed to hear. Weeks passed before Dowd finally spoke to her. He noticed the way she watched, how she leaned forward at every high note, how she held her breath during the soft ones. One evening, he smiled and asked if she wanted to learn. Lena didn't speak, but she nodded. And for the first time in months, her mother saw a spark return to her eyes. But the girl had no instrument, only the broken violin from their escape. When Dowd first saw it, he traced the cracks with his fingers as gently as a doctor examining an injured limb. "This violin has survived more than any of us," he murmured. "It deserves to sing again." He scavenged what he could. Bits of wood carved into new pegs, electrical tape from a supply tent, strings begged, borrowed, traded from anyone who had a spare. None of them matched, none of them were new. But when he placed the violin back into Lena's hands, repaired but still bearing its scars, the child looked as if someone had handed her a piece of her father back. Every day afterward, no matter the cold, no matter the hunger, no matter the noise of thousands of displaced souls living too close together, Lena practiced. She practiced the same way she breathed, with necessity. One night, her mother asked her why she played so much. Lena's voice was tiny when she answered, "Because when I play, I can hear Papa." The violin remembers him, and when I play, he comes back. From that day on, her mother never questioned the hours she spent with the instrument. When they were granted resettlement in the United States, Dowd cried as he hugged her goodbye. "Promise me you will keep playing," he told her. "Promise me you will show the world that our country is not just destruction. We come from music. We come from beauty. You must carry that for all of us now," she promised. Now, here she was, on a brightly lit stage in Los Angeles, surrounded by cameras, a host known for his humor, and an audience who had no idea what kind of story had just walked into their lives wearing a hand-me-down dress. The host, a man whose laughter usually filled the room with warmth, bent down to greet her. His tone softened when he noticed the state of her violin. "Sweetheart, your violin has seen better days," he said kindly. "We've got new ones backstage if you want to use one for your performance." The translator whispered the offer into Arabic. Lena's reaction was immediate. She jerked the instrument away, clutching it tightly, shaking her head so fast her curls bounced. She spoke urgently, voice trembling. When the translator relayed the girl's words, the audience fell silent. "She says she cannot play another violin. This one belonged to her father. He died in the war. She says the music he played is still inside it. If she plays a different violin, she says he won't be able to play with her." The host's face crumpled. The audience shifted in their seats, moved by something deeper than television emotion. The host apologized softly, his eyes red. "You hold on to that violin, little one. You play it for him." And Lena nodded, once like a warrior accepting a mission. Then she lifted the battered violin to her shoulder. Everyone expected a scratchy sound, maybe a few shaky notes from mismatched strings. Instead, the moment her bow touched the first string, the room transformed. The music that poured out did not sound like it belonged to the violin she carried. It was clear, pure. It rose and fell like a memory taking shape. She played a melody her father had taught her when she was too young to reach the footrest. A melody her teacher in the camp had helped her refine. A melody that lived in the deepest rooms of her heart. The audience watched as the little girl swayed, eyes closed, lost in a world only she could see. The host sat on the floor, stunned. Crew members stopped mid-task. Even the camera operators blinked through their own tears to stay focused. When the final note faded, there was a beat of total stillness. And then the audience exploded into applause, louder, longer, more emotional than anything the show had ever captured. The host wrapped her in a gentle hug and whispered, "Your father would be so proud." Lena whispered something back. The translator's voice cracked as she translated. "She says she knows. She says she felt him standing beside her." It was the kind of moment people remember for the rest of their lives. Not because of television, not because of talent, but because a child carrying the weight of loss and hope in history had made the world stop and listen. In the days that followed, the host helped her mother find work, arranged scholarships, and even contacted instrument experts to restore the violin, not to erase its scars, but to strengthen it without removing its story. When Lena received it back, she ran her fingers along every mark, every line in the grain. "It still sounds like Papa," she whispered, "but now it sounds like he's flying." Her performance went viral around the world. Donations to Refugee causes surged. Families volunteered to help new arrivals. Music schools reached out offering lessons. And somewhere in Germany, Dowd watched the video on a small phone screen and wept with pride, knowing a student had carried their homeland's music to a place where people listened. 5 years later, at 12 years old, Lena stood on a stage at the United Nations, holding the same violin. She spoke briefly before playing. Her voice was steady. "My father taught me that music is the language everyone understands. So this is how I tell our story." And when her bow met the strings, the room full of diplomats and leaders fell silent, just as that studio audience had years before, listening to the sound of a child who had carried her father's legacy across a world broken by war and turned survival into song. If you're hearing this now, let it be more than a story. Let it be a reminder that talent lives everywhere, even in the hardest places. Let it be a reminder that kindness can change a life. Let it be a reminder that your voice, your action, your compassion can become the one thing that keeps someone's music alive. If this touched you, share it. Tell others. Support a child's dream. Be part of someone's second chance. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person who decides to listen.